Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is February 29, 2016, and my guest is Marina Krakovsky, journalist and author. Her latest book is The Middleman Economy: How Brokers, Agents, Dealers, and Everyday Matchmakers Create Value and Profit. It's a short book, but it's one that's rich in applied economics and ideas and relevance for today's world of commerce. And it's our topic for today. Marina, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thank you, Russ.
Your introduction is titled, it's got a great title, No One Likes a Middleman, but Most of Us Are Middlemen. Let's look at both parts of that sentence. Why do you write No One Likes a Middleman?
Well, this is a big theme in my book, is that people have long been suspicious of middlemen. People tend to think, and this is true across cultures as far as I can see and across time, to think of middlemen as parasites, as people who aren't actually producing anything. They're not creating any value. They're just sort of living off the efforts of others. And, of course, a big part of my book is to challenge that view.
Is it true?
Well, it can be true. It is true in some cases, or we think that it's true, to some extent. But more often than not, middlemen would not stay in business if they didn't genuinely provide value.
Yeah, I think that observation, which in what your book does extremely well, is tell us what that value is. It's not obvious sometimes. But I think people have a suspicion that there must be some exploitation going on if somebody who's, quote, not doing anything is making money off the rest of us. And I think that presumption, which comes, unfortunately, from a combination of there are such occasionally parasites who are able to pull that off, often with the help of, say, regulation that prevents certain things from happening, but also from just lack of understanding of what profits and the world of commerce is about. It does create a lot of, I think, built-in suspicion. So why do you write we are all middlemen?
Well, this is just the idea that...
Or most of us, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, middlemen are sort of hidden in plain sight. I mean, anybody who's connecting other people in a network is a middleman, roughly speaking, particularly if they're providing value in that process. And so certainly brokers and agents and dealers and salespeople, which, certainly constitute a huge part of the economy, they fit the bill. But also people in non-obvious middleman jobs like, wedding planners or people, who are middle managers in a company who are transmitting messages and coordinating the efforts of multiple people. These are also middlemen. I mean, if we really stop to think about what we do and the role that we play in our own social networks, we are all middlemen. And the question really becomes, what value can we create? What more can we do to facilitate productive activity within our own networks?
I guess in some sense I am a middleman, even though I don't charge my listeners through Liberty Fund, the sponsor of this podcast. And unfortunately, I don't pay my guests other than through the excitement of reaching a broader audience. But you could create your own podcast and reach out to people who are interested in your ideas or to try to interest people in the ideas in your book. But you're using a middleman.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually why middlemen have become more prevalent with the rise of the Internet. And the Internet has reduced distribution cost, has enabled many people to take on these traditional gatekeeper roles, instead of a radio station or TV network or, magazine deciding who to have on as a guest or whom to interview. Now it's, anybody who's running a podcast or a blog or the like is playing that same role. And so there are many, many more people playing those middleman roles.
And as a result, the middlemen who are involved in that process, say, of publicizing a book, it used to be there were a handful of places you tried to get your author on, and now it's a much broader list. It's a much more challenging and, I suppose, game than it used to be.
Yes, and it's always changing.
So it's interesting that the internet has increased the potential for intermediaries. You quote Bill Gates that people would originally, I don't know which part of this is Bill Gates. His part is the phrase friction-free capitalism. But some people, maybe it was Gates, but certainly others who thought that, well, once the internet comes along and we can all look for stuff, we're going to have friction-free capitalism now. We don't need – search costs are almost zero. We're not going to need middlemen anymore. No intermediaries, just going to go straight to the source. And that certainly has not happened. Why not?
That's right. I mean, the essence of it is that transaction costs have fallen for everybody, but they have fallen more, in most cases, for professional middlemen than they have for the rest of us. And so if professional middlemen can do their work more efficiently than we can, then it still makes sense for us to turn to the professionals rather than doing things ourselves.
So let's take an example, one of the more mundane but fascinating examples that you mentioned a minute ago is the wedding planner. What role does how do you make a living as a wedding planner? I mean, there are people who do this for their friends or used to do it for their friends and go out and try to help the bride or the groom get stuff done that was needed for the day of the wedding. But now there's a very specialized task called a wedding planner that is persisting in the modern world. How did it come about and why does it persist?
Yeah, well, wedding planners have been around for a long time, but they were seen as a luxury and something that only people who, spend a fortune on their weddings can afford. And now more and more people are hiring wedding planners. And most of us, if we think about a wedding planner, we think of a coordinator, someone who just handles all the logistics and, all the hassles of planning a wedding. But a wedding planner actually does a lot more in this middleman sense. So I see a wedding planner as fulfilling a couple of main roles. One of them is the concierge, the person who is handling all the pesky little details and making the process of planning a wedding as simple and carefree as possible for a bride, and also helping the bride make all these high stakes decisions without getting too anxious about it. So that's the concierge role, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. But I think more interestingly, a wedding planner is also an enforcer. And what I mean by an enforcer is a person who has the clout to keep both sides honest. And in this case, it's primarily keeping the wedding vendors honest. You can get the same list of vendors that a wedding planner might use, but those same professionals are probably not going to do as good a job for you as they would for the professional wedding planner. And there are various reasons for that. I mean, one of them is just that the wedding planner can speak the language of both sides, because of her, typically it's a she, her experience planning weddings. She knows how to talk to florists and bakers and all the other photographers and so on, and understands what brides want, and so is sort of a translator, a cultural broker between the two sides. But more importantly, I think the wedding planner just has these long-run has a long-run reputation and long-run relationships with all these vendors that she can leverage on behalf of the bride. So a bride is not going to be a repeat customer, and therefore just won't be able to get the same level of quality and service working directly.
So I thought this was a fantastic example. Again, it's pretty mundane, but it really highlights the economics, I thought, really beautifully. So in a way, and you list 6 different types of middlemen, and they overlap, and as you point out also, we'll probably get to all 6, but the enforcer is one of them. Somebody enforces quality. The concierge is a second. But you think of a concierge in the modern world as being somewhat obsolete because, hey, I can use Google. I can look up florists. I can see how they're rated. And I thought the point you made, first of all, sometimes that list is very long. And sometimes there are things about florists that you don't know, that doesn't come up in the reviews, that are very idiosyncratic relative to what's important to you, what's important to this particular wedding, this venue, the way you want them arranged, whatever it is that the wedding planner can do, and then pick from that list in a way that you can't. But I think the deeper point is the one which I love, is the one you made, that that even if you had the list of who are the really good ones, say, there might be some ones who have good reviews who aren't good, or who are the ones who are right for you, how they will perform is not the same. And I think people forget that effort's really important, and that any one time there's a potential for slacking and not doing the best job, and that the long-term perspective of that wedding planner has a huge impact in terms of the incentives facing those vendors.
Exactly. You put that very well. It's really that distinction between, adverse selection and moral hazard, the assessing out the intrinsic quality of somebody, the potential to do a good job versus their incentive to actually do a good job on any given transaction. In the long run, player has an advantage over the one-time buyer in eliciting the highest quality service at any one time.
And there's a real art to the concierge part. As you point out, a lot of people now, they don't want to see a person. They're happy to sit in their hotel room, the literal concierge. They're happy to sit in their hotel room and Google around for restaurants or sightseeing or things they want to do. So how does a human concierge compete effectively? I gave one example. Sometimes you'll know that a rating was earned a long time ago, and they've lost their quality isn't what it used to be. But a really first-rate concierge can still thrive in today's world. How is that possible?
Yeah, it happens because, there are individual differences. Some people definitely do prefer to do things by themselves, and they don't mind spending hours and hours figuring things out for themselves, like a big trip that you're planning. To me, that's the classic example. If you're planning a simple trip, it's very easy to do this yourself, and it doesn't take very much time, and, you jump on your favorite website and you make your bookings, and you can do that very quickly and easily without much angst. But if you're planning a complex vacation to a destination you've never been to, and there are gazillion choices, and you're the kind of person who doesn't really enjoy doing hours and hours of internet research, and if you're the kind who gets anxious about making the right decision or the wrong decision, then you're the perfect candidate to work with a concierge, in the sense that I'm using concierge, the travel agent who specializes in your destination, who's planned these kinds of trips for many, many past clients, who's very good at matching your deepest, needs and wants with the kinds of options that are available in that destination. They can save you a lot of time and self-doubt about making the wrong decision by planning out an itinerary that is pretty well customized to what you want.
Yeah, I took a trip to London last year. I'd never been to London, and there's 80 hotels in the area that I'm pretty sure I know where I want to be in terms of geography, which part of London. But there's 80 hotels that have pretty good ratings, and I'm not convinced they're all going to be fine. Sometimes they're all fine, right? Yeah. But all of them have negative reviews, and you're always wondering, was that just that crazy person who didn't like the orange juice, or is that, scary?
That's exactly right. Yeah, actually, the travel agent that I interviewed for this book said you never know, who the person is. Is it somebody in their underwear sitting in their basement writing the review? And so she can suss out those kinds of things. But even if you knew that all those reviews were good, there's still that matching process, and there's the question of how do you factor in, how do you weigh all these various factors, the location and the price, and there's just so many aspects to a hotel to figure out. So that one decision can easily bog you down. And so this is where it's really helpful to have somebody just kind of make that decision for you.
Yeah, I was impressed there's still travel agents because I don't use one. And it's an interesting thing. I don't travel to London often. I could imagine going again in the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. But I'll probably go back to the same hotel, and that may not be the best thing. It'll be fine. So I'm probably going to, since it was okay, I'm probably going to go back to the same one. But I think what's interesting is how hard it is when you're doing something infrequently. Ideally, getting married is something you only do once. You might do it 2 or 3 times, but you probably won't do it even if you do it more once, you're probably not doing it in the same city. So this opportunity to rely on somebody else's expertise is really pretty fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. And it's underappreciated. I think, after writing this book, I've started outsourcing more of those kinds of tasks the thing about the internet is it's very easy to feel like, yes, I can do it myself, so why should I ask somebody else to do it? But, it's just so easy to dive in and drown, as somebody put it.
And it's worth pointing out that even when you use the internet, often you're using a middleman. So I happen to use Kayak a lot. Kayak's a middleman, right? I don't go to each hotel's website. I don't go to or TripAdvisor. I don't go to each airplane or each airline or each hotel's website. I use an internet intermediary.
That is so true. Yeah, the internet is full of middlemen like that, and then the question becomes, well, which middleman do I trust, and how do I compare them? And yeah, it's just very easy to get sucked in.
So let's talk about an example of an intermediary and a middleman on the internet, which is OpenTable. So OpenTable, again, as an economist, really interesting example. Talk about what their business model, how it started, and the challenges they faced and how they overcame them through the decisions they made.
Yeah, OpenTable is an interesting example to dive into because as diners, we sort of take it for granted. It just seems so simple, but there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes to make it all work. Because it's a two-sided market, and with two-sided markets, you always have this challenge of getting both sides on board, because OpenTable would not be valuable to diners if plenty of restaurants were not on it. And so the first challenge, so even if you give away the service for free to the diners, there's still the challenge of getting restaurants to sign up and to pay for being on it. And restaurants pay a monthly fee, and they also pay a booking fee that is about $1 typically for every seat for every person in the party making the reservation. And it was actually really hard to sell this idea to restaurants, even though restaurants stood to benefit a lot. I mean, they got marketing as a result, and the big selling point is to be able to fill in seats at the last minute.
It's a just to make it clear for those who don't know, it's a reservation service to make reservations at a restaurant, which seemed like kind of a trivial thing. Why would I need to get on why can't I just call the restaurant, make a reservation? It's bizarre on the surface that such a thing could make a profit.
Yeah. So, to step back, yes, this actually solves a big problem for diners, which is that you're trying to make a reservation, and typically you have to call, without a service like OpenTable, you have to call restaurants one by one to see if they have a table available for your size party at your time, and it can be, it can be a pain if you've ever been through this process. Sometimes you have to leave a message and hope that somebody will call you back, and often there is no availability. But if you go to a site like OpenTable, which, you can also get an app for it, then with just a few taps, you get to see right in front of you who has openings for when you want in the area that you want. So it greatly simplifies that search process. So that's it from the customer's point of view.
How about from the restaurant?
Why
would they bother?
Okay, well, so for them, there are a few benefits, but the biggest, basically it boils down to filling those tables and also not having to answer the phone as often, not dealing with that appointment book, even though, most restaurants will also take reservations over the phone, even if they're using OpenTable. And so the promise to the restaurant is that they will have fewer openings, because diners will be able to see, oh, look, here's an opening at 7:00. I can't get a table anywhere else, but I can get one at this restaurant. And boom, you've got your booking, and the restaurant has a table filled. So that's great for both sides.
But the challenge the restaurant faces, which was the interesting part that I didn't think enough about from the value proposition that OpenTable is providing. You've mentioned some of them, but one of them is the fact that it's kind of obvious that not everybody keeps a reservation. And so a last-minute cancellation or a no-show, a simple no-show, they make the reservation and don't show up, can be disastrous for a restaurant. It's very expensive to leave that table unfilled, to have held it and then not fill it. And so the obvious way to do that, to avoid that, is to charge people to make reservations, but that has a problem too. So talk about the challenges that has, and then how OpenTable manages to reduce no-shows and cancellations.
Yeah, cancellations are not as big a problem for restaurants as no-shows, because if somebody cancels before they show up, then the restaurant could still take a walk-in, potentially at least. Whereas if you made a reservation and you just don't show up, then you're like a dog in the manger. You're holding on to that table, and the restaurant can't give it away. But at the same time, the restaurant hasn't taken your money. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing because it's part of the hospitality industry, but it's just different parts of the hospitality industry work differently. So hotels take a non-refundable deposit. They take your credit card basically. So if you don't show up, your credit card still can get charged. But for whatever reason, it's traditionally been a no-no in the restaurant industry to charge diners. And if you were the one restaurant that sticks its neck out and tries this thing, well, that's going to hurt you. So there has to be some kind of change, a collective change, and that's starting to happen with higher end restaurants and in big cities sometimes. But when OpenTable was starting out, this was basically unheard of, and so restaurants could not charge for a reservation. They couldn't do it themselves. They couldn't do it through OpenTable. In fact, I don't know if OpenTable even considered it. So they're stuck with this problem of no-shows, and no-shows can be a problem online, or they could be a problem over the phone. There's just a perennial bane of restaurants' existence. But their fear was, when OpenTable came to pitch their service to the restaurants, the restaurateurs feared that no-shows would actually be more common if people could make their bookings through OpenTable. And their concern was that people just would not take these online reservations seriously, that OpenTable was making it too easy to create a new account. You could become, John Doe at yahoo.com or John Doe 357 at yahoo.com, or just to have multiple accounts and make reservations and then no-show with impunity. And so OpenTable, to convince restaurants that this wouldn't happen, really had to create policies to minimize the chances that this would happen. And they did a bunch of things about that. And it's very tricky to do because they didn't want to make you sign up with an official email address. They did want to make it easy for diners. So there's always this need to keep both sides happy, and they managed to do that. And they did it in a number of ways. One of them was this loyalty program, which gave people an incentive to kind of just stick with one email address because they would get rewards. They'd get these points for every reservation that they made and actually completed, and they would get a cash payout after a certain number of these. So they wanted to stick with the same email address. And also the restaurant, OpenTable would remind people of their reservation a day or two beforehand, which is such a simple move, but it's really helpful because people just don't think about the restaurant. I think about this, but most people probably don't think about this. The people who routinely no-show are not thinking about the problems that their no-show is causing the restaurant. So it's not necessarily that they're being selfish or malicious. They're just not thinking of it. And so that little reminder email often is all it takes to get people to show up. And then if they don't show up, then OpenTable also keeps track of that. So after a certain number, yeah.
Go ahead, keep going. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that after a certain number of no-shows, they get kicked off the site. So there are consequences, and these are the kinds of consequences that OpenTable, as a middleman, is in a better position to impose than any restaurant could on its own, because they're aggregating data from across restaurants, right? So they know that I have not showed up at this restaurant and that restaurant and the other restaurant, whereas any one restaurant would only know about that one no-show and would also have a harder time just barring a customer from making a reservation in the future. So it's just one of the many ways that a middleman has an advantage over the buyer or the seller interacting directly.
And I think, don't they send out it's sort of thoughtfully worded if you miss the reservation. So it's not like, how could you do this, you awful person, but did something go wrong? Do you remember what that is? I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that is that OpenTable is not on site. It's not like there's a company representative at each restaurant checking people in. So they have to go by whatever the restaurant is telling them. But at the same time, they know that the restaurant might not always be honest with them, because the restaurant has an incentive to report a no-show, just a small incentive to cheat that way.
Well,
that thereby,
$1.
yeah, saving $1
That's
for
a
each
lot of
person.
money. Yeah.
You know, and restaurants very quickly realize that it's just not worth it, and OpenTable will be on to them. But I mean, what's really clever about this is that OpenTable is able to police all of this from a distance. They're really asking the diner to then say, no, I was there. What are you talking about? And that's how they can resolve these disputes. And of course, if the restaurants realize that there's this loop, that the diner will have a say in the matter, then they quickly learn not to, play those games.
So I just wanted to speculate for a minute, because you talked about the cultural phenomenon and hospitality industry that, if you stay in a hotel, they usually give you a rule that if you don't cancel within a certain time frame, it's usually 24 or 48 hours, they're going to charge your credit card. Of course, you know that in advance. They tell you that. The first time you might not know it, but you eventually learn it. Mm-hmm. Whereas other types of no-showing, like restaurants, typically have no cost. Now, one argument would be, well, you don't know how much you're going to spend at the restaurant, whereas the room's fixed. You know what kind of room it is. But restaurants could charge a flat fee, $10, $20. And so just to think about it for a minute, it's an interesting dinner table economics question for those of you out there who you might want to pause this and think about it on your own for a minute. I'm just thinking about it here. I'm going to give my answer, and then I'm going to let Marina respond. But it seems to me that, of course, we do pay for the no-shows. They just get spread across everybody. It's part of the cost of doing business. It's somewhat akin, not exactly, but it's somewhat akin to somebody walking out on a bill or stealing something out of the hotel. In the case of a hotel, like a towel or something else. It's part of the cost of doing business. Every restaurant knows that some reservations won't be shown. People won't show up. And so they can't maximize their capacity on any one night. And since they have to make a living and cover their fixed costs and a little bit more to make it worthwhile, presumably the prices on the menu reflect that. So you're paying, it's just in a very hidden way that gives you the flexibility of canceling without a direct cost. It's built into the cost of every meal in most restaurants that take reservations. So then the question would be, why doesn't a restaurant come along and charge lower prices on their menu, but reservation fees, so that people who are honest and keep their word will be able to enjoy cheaper meals? And I guess the answer there would be that most of us want the flexibility of choosing where we eat on any one night. We might want to make a reservation a few hours in advance or a day in advance or a week in advance, but we like the freedom to change our mind, or something comes up much more often than a trip to a faraway city gets canceled with a hotel reservation. So I think that might be part of the reason why that cultural norm is there. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting analysis, and you just reminded me of something else that is very clever that OpenTable is doing. It's so simple. When you said that people want the flexibility of making a spur-of-the-moment decision about where to dine, people in the early days would make multiple reservations for the same exact time, which is obviously impossible to fulfill. And so one of the rules that OpenTable instituted very early on is that you cannot make two reservations within 2 hours of one another. Such a simple, technological fix to a problem. So that was interesting. Yeah, I don't really know why the cultural norm exists. And, of course, there are exceptions to that. If you want to make a reservation for New Year's Eve party, a prefix, you know what the price is. You have to put your credit card down, or some popular restaurants in New York City, or large parties and so on. The restaurant is always trying to balance the cost of, the possibility of a no-show with the cost of, disgruntled customers. I think that norm is beginning to change very slowly, but I really can't say why it's been the way it's been. Sometimes these things just sort of evolve for no good reason.
Yeah, we talked on this program before about the fact that the markup for food contains the fact that you sit at the table for a while. And this was an insight I first heard from Earl Thompson, who was at UCLA. And Earl made the point that the longer it takes to eat something, the more expensive it is to the restaurant, because it takes a longer time for the table to turn over, and that means the number of customers per night is going to be lower, and that means you have to recover your fixed costs from a smaller group of people, and therefore the prices have to be higher. And it's just I think it's a fantastic insight that captures part of what's going on.
That's right. And yet, I just want to add to that when you do takeout at that same restaurant and you're not costing them a table at all, you still pay the same price. I don't know any restaurant that charges less for takeout than for dining in.
Well, actually, some do.
Okay.
In fact, Emily Scarbeck at EconLog, a sister site of EconTalk under the Library of Economics and Liberty, was recently speculating about that. And of course, some takeout prices are cheaper, but of course, then you have to monitor people who do the takeout thing and then go sit down.
Right.
Which is one of the challenges of charging different prices. But what I was going to say, I'd lost my train of thought, but it's back, is that given that it takes longer, one solution to that would be to charge, have a meter at each table that is how long you're there. If you want to dawdle over your coffee, you can, or your dessert, or whatever it is. And of course, people, that somehow takes some of the fun out of the dining, that the clock's ticking on you like that, I guess.
Well, it bursts that bubble of romance around the dining experience, where you feel like you're a guest at somebody's house, and even though you have to pay at the end of the meal, it's not always in your face.
And there are guests who probably should have a meter in your own house even, but we'll leave that to the side. But a serious thought is that Starbucks, lets you in the sense that there's no explicit rule against it. You can sit and buy a cup of coffee and use it as your home office for hours. Yes. And they never say, can I get you anything else? And meanwhile, people who come in who'd like to sit down for 15 minutes can't find a table. It's a very interesting decision they've made to not only not meter how long you're at the table, but not encourage you to buy more stuff to earn the right to sit at that table. It's basically a rent-free loan all day. With a purchase of anything. And even, I suppose, if you just sat down, they probably would leave you alone, too. Kind of like a public library with coffee on the side.
Yeah.
I want to turn to an issue that you discuss in the book that's really fascinating, which is some of these jobs, and the wedding planner is one of them, and to some extent Open Table is another, but the wedding planner is a particularly good example. The skill set of the woman that you highlight in the book and feature in the book, in a way, there's nothing explicitly obvious about what she's, quote, good at. She makes a very good living, evidently. She makes a relatively large amount of money and does this not just, as you point out, not just for high-end fancy weddings, but for more average cost weddings. People are willing to pay something to not trivial amount to get her assistance. How does that persist? Why doesn't competition, there are no barriers to entry in her case, there usually aren't in these kind of situations. What's keeping her fees as high as they are?
Yeah, this is a question I explore in the book, and I think it comes down to being able to make increasingly good matches the longer you are in business. And there's an interesting study I talk about that deals with placement agencies and how they're able to make better and better matches, and these economists actually were able to analyze, the numbers and to find that, I don't remember the details, but something to the effect that the more that a given client is, well, actually not a given client, but like a worker is with a particular agency, the higher the markup that agency can charge for that worker's service, for that worker's time. And furthermore, the more of that markup that the agency can keep. So the agency benefits more from the longevity of that relationship than does the client, than does the worker. So what's going on with the wedding planners is somewhat similar, I think, which is that the longer that they do business with the various wedding vendors in their town, the more they know, which florist can make a beautiful bouquet of daffodils or orchids or whatever it is, and which linen provider, happens to have, silver tablecloths. I'm not very good at coming up with these examples.
I can't help but mention that when somebody tells us they're getting married, I always say, remember that no one remembers the color of the napkins. And the amount that people agonize over these decisions always depresses me. So I'm just going to say that. Right. Carry on.
Yes. But these are all things that are very, very important to the brides. And, having been a bride, I understand that. It's, supposedly the most important day of your little life.
Some grooms also care about the color of the napkins. I just wasn't one of them. I just want to say that.
Okay. So, anyway, going back to the wedding planners, they know who to go to. They can do this very efficiently, and they can do it with increasing efficiency and increasing quality over time. And so it's hard for a new wedding planner to compete with that, and having the reputation, of course, for doing all of that also makes it easier for the established, just like in any business, for the established wedding planners to get the new business.
But I never thought about that with the employment agencies. It stuns me when I read the markups that employment agencies are able to earn. And some of that is due to the fact that they absorb some of the costs of a lawsuit. They absorb some of the costs of unemployment. They, unfortunately or not, the regulatory stuff around laborers and working has gotten more expensive, which means that it's more and more profitable for someone to take on all those costs in not just in suggesting workers, but in being the employer for and sending out people as temporary workers, but they work for the agency, not for the client. But the point that it's always difficult to ascertain quality, and that I can't just tell an employer that I'm a fabulous worker, but that somebody that vouches for me and whose reputation is on the line. It's really the ability to create a brand name around something that doesn't normally have a brand name, or a brand name that's hard to establish.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now you're talking about what I call the certifier role, the ability to credibly certify because you're staking your long-term reputation on your recommendation. That is one of the unappreciated or underappreciated values that a middleman brings to these transactions. So a placement agency, is an example of that.
And I was surprised to see it. One of the other surprises in the book that's happening on Craigslist and eBay, which I'm not a big consumer or a provider of stuff on those sites. The idea that there are people reselling stuff on Craigslist, used stuff. Now, one of the reasons, I guess, is that it's hard to have a brand name for used stuff. It had a brand name once when it was new, but you don't know what it's gone through. So you don't know quite exactly how good the quality is. You can take a picture, which is nice, which helps. For some goods, that's enough. But for other goods, it's not. And talk about people who are making a reasonable living, or at least have been, on Craigslist, reselling other people's stuff that's available on Craigslist, which was amazing to me.
I know. It's so counterintuitive, like, can anything be more direct than Craigslist? Well, I guess you can think of other things because Craigslist itself is a kind of middleman, but why do you need additional middlemen?
Middleman on the middleman.
Exactly. And it's not just on Craigslist, it's on eBay, it's on LinkedIn, it's on YouTube. It actually happens all over the place. Middlemen emerge to serve these various needs. And I think the biggest need that a middleman can fill on Craigslist, and this is the person I profile, is to provide liquidity to both sides. You know, the person who has an appliance that they're eager to get rid of because they're moving or because they just need quick cash, they're in desperate straits, and they just want to get rid of it, you know, as quickly as possible. So they're willing to take, very little money for it. And that's what the middleman on Craigslist can do. He can swoop in as soon as he sees it, and he's the first one there, and he takes that appliance off that person's hands. And at the same time, he's able to provide that immediacy to the would-be buyer because he's not leaving that price artificially low. You know, he gathers up the inventory when prices are low, which tends to be cyclical, and then he puts it out there at a price where it won't get scooped up necessarily the same day, but because of his experience, he knows that it will get bought at that price within a reasonable amount of time, and he's willing to sit patiently and wait for that to happen, and that provides a service to the buyers because there's a good chance that an appliance will be available on Craigslist when the buyer needs it.
And that person's actually taking the appliance into his house. It's not like one of these paper transactions where he's listing it. He's not. So that's what was interesting about it. He's not just creating his own list of what's for sale on Craigslist. He's buying it and then reselling it, but he's taking it. He's actually receiving it in the meantime, right?
Yes. He does buy it outright, but, you know, it's very cheap. So, you know, it's not like a huge capital investment. He holds on to these appliances in his garage. You know, he can fit 15 or 20 washers or dryers there, and then he flips them. He turns around and sells them within days. And he
makes, is this a full-time living? I think it was, right?
Yeah, it's a full-time job, and it's a solid middle-class income. He reports making $1,200 to $1,500 a week doing this, you know, profit.
It's a lot of money. The other thing I was shocked about is the power seller role on eBay. I think you said 4% of the sellers on eBay are half of the merchandise. Do I have that number right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. More than half of all sales on eBay flow through what are called power sellers, which are essentially middlemen, because to get that power seller designation, you need a certain sales volume and a certain minimum feedback score, which is rather high. And so you end up to achieve and sustain that level, you need to be basically a middleman, buying and selling other people's stuff. So most trade on eBay does not happen the way that it was originally built. It's not, Pez dispenser collectors trading with one another. It's a lot of it is professional middlemen buying somebody else's used designer fashion is the example that I use, and then selling it to people all over the world who are interested in the same stuff.
Yeah, it's like running a perpetual garage sale where you're always buying stuff from other garage sales and just you've got a reputation for throwing out the junk and keeping the better stuff, and so it persists. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a hated middleman, which is a used car dealer. Mm-hmm. A lot of people resent when they go to sell their car. They notice that if they sell it themselves, they can get a much, much better price than the dealer will give them, and they then tend to say, well, it figures dealers are awful. But explain why there's that gap to start with, and then how a middleman named Car Lots, a company called Car Lots, is trying to change that process.
Right. I mean, there are really three sets of prices. There's a dealer trade-in price, there's a sell-it-yourself price, and then there's the price that a dealer could command. So if you're not a dealer, then you're really choosing between trading in your used car. I'm talking from the point of view of someone who's trying to sell a car now. You can trade it into a dealer and get much, much less than if you sold it yourself. Those are your two main options, and neither is very attractive because they both have huge downsides. There's a lot less, it's a huge hassle to try to sell a car yourself, but if you sell it to a dealer, then you're going to lose a lot of money. So what Car Lots is doing is they're trying to step into the middle in this sense, the middle of the market, to give you kind of the best of both worlds. So the benefit of selling it yourself, meaning that you get to keep a lot of the value of the car, but also the benefit of selling to a dealer, which is that you don't have to deal with all the hassles. And their model is to make the process as efficient and as transparent as possible, which is what the traditional used car sales process has lacked, and why so many people hate used car dealers. And to address your question of why there's this gap, so part of it is the lemons problem, right? The problem that the owner of a car knows more about the quality of the car than the buyer does, and so you kind of have to assume that the quality isn't very good, or you have to pay a mechanic to inspect it, and there's a cost to that. But a bigger problem, according to this guy who started Car Lots, is that when you trade in your car, you're just at the very beginning of a very long, inefficient supply chain, and so your car has to go from a dealer to a wholesaler to an auction house to another dealer, and there's transportation and there's a time lag, and so the car is depreciating,
yes.
And so there's just a lot of leakage throughout the process.
So what is Car Lots doing differently?
So Car Lots buys, well, it actually doesn't buy your car, first of all. It takes it on consignment, and then they, instead of trying to, okay, so there are a few things. They take it on consignment rather than buying it. They charge a service fee for selling your car. Instead of profiting from, buying low and selling high, they charge a service fee to both the seller and the buyer, and that fee is fixed regardless of what they sell the car for. And they also don't pass that car on to a long chain of other intermediaries. They sell it directly on their own lots.
So I guess the argument there, what they're trying to, again, there's sort of the business proposition is that I don't have to be home all the time. They're relying to meet the prospective buyer of my car. They get good at vetting buyers' reliability. So one person shows up at my house and I have to take their check, or I'm not sure, or it takes a while, they've got to get a bank check. So they can get better at, say, credit and other things. Mm-hmm. And they also have the economies of scale. They have lots of cars. So there's more people are going to come there than want to come to, economizing on the search costs, right? So it seems like you say, it's sort of the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And I mean, it really even comes down to something as simple as posting pictures of your car. Most of us, when we sell our car, we can maybe take, 5, 10 pictures of our car. That just seems like a big deal. It's not something we do all the time. Whereas typically they'll take 85 pictures, and they know exactly what angles they need, what customers will be looking for, and they do it in a matter of minutes because, it's like an assembly line for them. So they can do it very efficiently. And then whereas we might post it on Craigslist or maybe Cars.com, they post it on 10 sites. So they're just better at doing everything that you could on your own. They just, this is their pros. This is what they do.
And right now they're in one city. Is that correct? Or are they expanding?
Yeah, they've expanded. Even when I was speaking with them a year or more ago, they were already in several cities in Virginia, and they were expanding out to a few other states.
So CarMax does that as well, I guess. But I think the part that's interesting about them is that if you go to CarMax, you get an estimate for what they'll pay you for your car, which is very nice because it's real. It's an actual amount. It's not complicated like the dealer when you're doing a trade-in. You're never sure how much of it's actually the value of the car versus what you're really paying for the new car. But here, I guess the other part that's the novelty of it, just the fixed amount. And it's a fixed amount. It's the consignment aspect of it. It's a fixed amount per car. And as you point out, that tends to encourage them. It encourages people who want to sell higher value cars in general, because obviously if it's too high amount extra, that you still might want to sell yourself.
Yeah. They charge a fixed fee regardless of the final sale price of the car. And what's also interesting about that is that because they charge a fixed fee, the buyers also take that as a signal that these dealers, these salespeople, aren't pushing a particular car on me. They're really in the service business of trying to help me find the best car for me, because they have no incentive to push any particular car.
So I don't want to miss your taxonomy here. Your 6 categories are the bridge, the certifier, the enforcer, the risk bearer, the concierge, and the insulator. I think we've talked about 3 of them, and really the bridge we've talked about, I think, implicitly. So that's 4. But talk about the risk bearer and the insulator.
Okay. Well, so the risk bearer is very much related to being a certifier or enforcer, but it's all about really trying to pool the risk and discern external risk from what I call internal risk, but which economists would know as counterparty risk. So if you're a certifier or an enforcer, you have to know that the parties you're dealing with are trusted. That's what I would call the internal risk. And you want to avoid internal risk. You want to avoid dealing with people who are known for subpar quality or who you can't rely on. But you do want to embrace what I call external risk, the exogenous risk that we really cannot predict. Which startup company is going to take off and become the next Google or Facebook. And so venture capital, in the venture capitalist example, that's the kind of risk that they're in a position to embrace, because they're building a portfolio, right? They're aggregating risk from across many sources. And so they're in a better position to bear that kind of risk than someone who's just doing individual sales.
Talk about the insulator, I love. The insulator is the greatest.
Thank you. I think the insulator is so cool, and it's one that even economists don't really talk about much. The insulator, it's very different from the others, because the others are more about facilitating connections that aren't there, whereas an insulator is someone who keeps people apart in strategically important situations. So when we have an existing relationship, sometimes it's actually more difficult to say certain things to the other person. For example, to negotiate on your own behalf. There's often this trade-off between likability and assertiveness. You might be better off in the short run to assert yourself, but you might seem less likable to your trading partner. And so this is where someone like a sports agent or a lawyer can step in very shrewdly to intercede on your behalf, with your team or your client and so on. Publicists play this role with the media on behalf of their clients, because tooting your own horn is also another thing that is sort of unseemly to do. And so the insulator can be an important role, but it's sort of it's often invisible, or we don't appreciate it.
Yeah, it's utterly. The reason I find it so fascinating is that obviously most of the time middlemen put people together. So the idea that you keep them apart, so you do put them together, but you do it in a way that it's that arm's length thing, and it's very. Yeah. I think people underestimate. Again, they look at certain middlemen and they say, "Oh, they're a waste of money because all they do is take a fee." And of course, they also have to represent you at an arm's length, which means they might say things. Just like it's unseemly for you to say, pay me more money socially, it's also unseemly for the agent to not ask for enough or to ask for too much when you would have.
Exactly.
So there's a real risk, but it's worth it for most of these, in many of these cases, obviously.
Yeah, that's such a win-win, because what is bad for you is actually great for them. So, if you're a sports agent and you talk tough on behalf of your clients, well, you enhance your reputation as this, as this great advocate, and so athletes flock to you. So it's almost exactly the opposite of what you wouldn't do for yourself, because it would be bad for your image. Well, it'd be wonderful for the middleman's image to do those same things on behalf of another person.
I was actually making a different point. I was actually saying that the agent has to be really good at figuring out what the client would want in terms of both being aggressive and easygoing, because I'm not there. I'm not in the room. So sometimes, right? So the agent is talking to the press about the client, and the client's kind of like, can sometimes be grimacing like, no, I wouldn't have said it that way, or whatever it is. And so I think there's an incredible art. It comes back to your point about the wedding planner. I think you really have to, and you mentioned this a number of times with different kinds of intermediaries, you really have to be good at assessing the match, the quality of the match for both sides. You give the example in the book of the travel agent who says, I don't think you get to know that client well enough. You can say, I don't think that's going to be your favorite piece of that vacation. You probably would prefer to do this. And I think similarly for these insulators, their job is to be tough and sometimes easy, but they have to know when, and they have to make sure that their client likes the stance they've taken. I think that must be very difficult.
That's true. And I think you're getting into this other point about, human intelligence. These are soft skills. They're sort of intangible, but when they work well, you don't necessarily see them working really well, but there's a real art to a lot of what these people do.
So I want to close with an example close to both of our hearts, which is the publishing business. So we live in a time where it's easy to publish your own book. There are many, many companies out there that will self-publish. The distribution channel is there. On Amazon, they'll put your book up on their site. You can drive traffic to it, and you'll make, quote, all the profit. And yet you chose to publish your book with an intermediary, which was an interesting decision you had to make. You may have used an agent. I did both for my last book. I gave away money to my agent and my publisher I could have kept for myself. And I think a lot of people, when they hear how little authors make, they make somewhere usually between 10 and 15% of the book. What? You provided all the content and that's all you get? And the answer is yeah, and it's a great deal because I have an alternative. So it better be the case that they provide enough value to make that a decent proposition. Oh, and of that 50%, I give 15% of that to my agent. Or 10%. I don't even remember now. Sorry. But think how crazy that is. So why do we do that?
Yeah. Well, I would separate the agent and the publisher. But the publisher is a risk bearer, and it's a classic example of a risk bearer. If I get to keep all the profit, assuming there's any profit to be had, right? If I were to publish myself, what's certain is the cost. We don't know if we'll ever turn a profit, and particularly in something as uncertain as the publishing industry and any cultural industries, highly unpredictable. So I think a lot of first-time authors or people who are not in the industry just don't appreciate how hard it is to sell books, and it's just almost impossible. The odds are really stacked. The odds are really against you when you're publishing a book. Most books, I think the figure I've heard most often is 90% of books lose money, and the reason the publishers are able to stay solvent is that the remaining 10% make so much that they cover all the others. And of course,
nobody knows which.
Yeah. So as an author, you're just not in as good a position to build a portfolio. You cannot put out 100 books and hope that 10 of them are going to make enough money to cover the others. Yeah.
But the other factor is that the costs are there that are just hard to see. It's not just that you might not get them back because you might not sell books, but you sometimes forget there's editing, there's printing, there's the design of the cover. There's 1,000 things that make a finished product attractive and that people find out about. And I think it's just an example I like because there's so many times where people say, that people are being ripped off, and they don't realize what all the costs are. Yes,
and unfortunately, the more I don't want to say ignorant, the more new you are to it, the less you see those things. You may not even understand that you need a professional cover designer, because if your cover is not professionally designed, then people won't even click on it on Amazon, because it just signals right away that this is not a high quality product. So you kind of have to be in the know to even know that you need a publisher.
So let's close with a general question. We started off by saying that the Internet's going to kill off – people thought the Internet was going to kill off intermediaries. And, of course, it created through technology a whole bunch of intermediaries that we've talked about, some of them, Kayak or Uber, OpenTable. These are intermediaries where there aren't people providing a skill. And yet there's still plenty of cases where middlemen are actually human beings providing a skill, like the wedding planner we talked about and many others. Where do you think it's going? And what advice would you give to somebody who's worried about technology taking away their job? They're, the travel agent of the past. A lot of them did lose their jobs. And I assume there are other jobs that are at risk right now because of technology and the ability to provide these services cheaper through and of close enough value that human intermediaries, human middlemen will be obsolete in certain areas. What are your thoughts on where that might be going and what advice you might give?
Yeah, I think middlemen are becoming more important, as I hope I made clear. I think the travel agent example is a good one. We have fewer travel agents. The ones who no longer provide value, the mere order takers, are the ones that have largely fallen by the wayside, or if they exist at all, they're making close to minimum wage. The ones that are succeeding are ones who figured out what value they can still create in this day and age of abundant information. And in the case of a travel agent, it's a question of becoming an expert and being able to make sense of this glut of information that is out there. But there's certainly people who can be a certifier and use their expertise that way, who can commit to being in the business for the long term and thereby also be an enforcer, and all these other roles that I've talked about. So I think what the future holds, in both in terms of human competition and competition from machines, is to continually think about what you're doing to provide value and what you need to be charging that customers will be willing to pay as a fraction of the value that you're providing.
My guest today has been Marina Krakovsky. Her book is The Middleman Economy. Marina, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.